The hall went silent the moment Kalen Voss raised his hand and pointed at the woman kneeling before him. "I reject you," he said, his voice carrying across the stone chamber like a blade cutting through fog. "You are not fit to stand beside a king." Wren Ashford did not move. She knelt on the cold floor of the Ravenmoor Great Hall, her hands pressed against her knees, her head bowed so low that her hair fell forward and hid her face from the hundreds of pack members watching. She had known this moment might come. She had feared it every night since the elders announced the bonding ceremony. But hearing the words spoken aloud, in front of everyone she had ever known, felt like the floor had opened beneath her and swallowed her whole. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some gasped, others whispered behind cupped hands. Wren could feel every eye in the room pressing down on her like weight on her chest, and still she did not lift her head. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Kalen stood at the top of the stone steps, dressed in the deep green and silver of the Ravenmoor royal line, his jaw set hard, his eyes cold in a way that did not match the young alpha she remembered from years before, back when they were children who used to race each other through the training fields behind the old barracks. That boy was gone now. In his place stood a king who had learned, somewhere along the way, that softness was a weakness he could not afford. Beside him stood Dorian Ashcombe, the royal advisor, his hands folded neatly in front of him, a faint and careful smile touching the corner of his mouth. He leaned toward Kalen and spoke low enough that only the king could hear. "You are doing the right thing," Dorian murmured. "An Omega like her cannot carry the weight of a crown. The pack needs strength beside you, not fragility." Kalen did not answer him. He kept his eyes fixed on Wren, waiting for her to look up, waiting for some sign that she understood why this had to happen, though even he was not entirely certain he believed his own reasons anymore. He told himself it was about duty. He told himself the pack came first. He told himself 100 things in the space of a single breath, and none of them made the ache in his chest any smaller. Finally, Wren lifted her head. Her eyes were dry. Whatever tears had threatened to fall, she had forced them back down before they could betray her. She looked at Kalen with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not fear, not sadness, but something colder and more final. It was the look of someone closing a door forever. "Then it is done," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "I will not trouble you again." She rose to her feet on her own, refusing the hand that one of the guards offered her, and she walked out of the great hall without looking back, her spine straight, her steps unhurried, as though she were the one leaving a place unworthy of her, rather than the other way around. The doors closed behind her, with a heavy sound that echoed through the silent hall long after she was gone. Kalen stood frozen at the top of the steps for a long moment. The crowd began to murmur again, uncertain whether to celebrate the strength of their king or mourn the cruelty of what they had just witnessed. Dorian placed a hand on Kalen's shoulder. "You will forget her within a season," Dorian said. "A king cannot rule with his heart, only with his mind." Kalen said nothing. He turned and walked toward his private chambers, ignoring the bows and murmured greetings of the pack members who parted to let him pass. Behind the mask of a composed and powerful alpha, something inside him had already begun to crack, though it would take years before he understood exactly what that crack would cost him. That night, Wren Ashford left Ravenmoor territory with nothing but a small bag over her shoulder and the clothes on her back. She did not tell anyone where she was going, not even her closest friend, a healer named Ivy Calloway who had begged her to stay and fight for her place in the pack. Wren only shook her head. "There is nothing left here for me," she told Ivy at the edge of the northern woods, the wind pulling at her cloak, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. "I would rather build a new life somewhere no one knows my name than stay here and be a ghost in a place that no longer wants me." Ivy hugged her tightly, her eyes wet with tears that Wren refused to let herself share. "If you ever need anything," Ivy whispered, "you know where to find me." Wren nodded, pulled away, and walked into the darkness of the trees without another word. She did not look back at the lights of Ravenmoor Castle, glowing faintly behind her. She had already decided that whatever pain waited for her on the road ahead, it could not possibly be worse than the humiliation she had just survived. Years passed. Kalen Voss became exactly the king his father and his advisors had always wanted him to be. He expanded Ravenmoor's borders through careful alliances and quiet shows of strength. He settled disputes between smaller packs with a firmness that earned him respect, and sometimes fear, throughout the Northern Territories. He never took another mate, despite the constant pressure from his council to secure the bloodline. Whenever the subject was raised, he would simply say that the timing was not right, that there were more pressing matters to attend to, and the conversation would end there. What he did not say, what he barely admitted to himself even in the quiet hours of the night, was that no one else had ever felt right beside him. He would catch himself in meetings, staring at nothing, remembering the sound of Ren's laughter from when they were young, or the way she used to hum quietly while tending to injured pack members in the healing house. He told himself these memories meant nothing. He told himself the bond between them had been severed the moment he spoke the words of rejection, that whatever connection they once shared was long dead. He was wrong, though he would not learn how wrong for a long time yet. Dorian Ashcombe, meanwhile, had grown more powerful with each passing year. As Kaelin's most trusted advisor, he controlled much of the daily business of the kingdom, from trade agreements to border patrols to the training of new enforcers. Few questioned his authority, and fewer still noticed how carefully he positioned his own allies into positions of influence throughout the pack. He was patient. He had learned long ago that power built slowly was power that lasted, and he had no intention of allowing anyone, especially not a forgotten Omega with rare and dangerous gifts, to threaten the foundation he had spent years constructing. Because that was the truth Dorian kept buried beneath his calm smile and careful words. Ren Ashford was not weak. She had never been weak. Her gift for healing was unlike anything the pack had seen in generations, a rare ability that allowed her to mend wounds that should have been fatal, and sense sickness in a person's blood before any symptom appeared. Such power, in the hands of someone close to the throne, could easily eclipse an advisor's carefully built influence. Dorian had seen the danger years before anyone else had, and he had acted to remove it long before it could grow into something he could no longer control. He had planted doubts in Kaelin's mind slowly, over months, small comments here and there about the dangers of an unpredictable gift, about how the pack elders whispered fears of instability, about how a king needed a mate who represented strength the way the old stories described it, not the quiet, unassuming strength that Ren carried in her healing hands. By the time the bonding ceremony approached, Kaelin's mind had already been shaped by 100 careful lies dressed up as wisdom, and the rejection that followed felt, to him at the time, like his own decision. It was not. Far to the north, in a small village, nestled between rolling hills and a wide, slow river, Ren Ashford built a life for herself under a different name. She called herself simply Ren Hale now, and to the humans and quiet shifters who lived in that peaceful corner of the world, she was known as the healer, who asked no questions and turned no one away. Her small cottage sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by herb gardens she tended with the same careful hands that had once mended wounds inside the walls of Ravenmoor Castle. She had built walls around her heart just as carefully as she had built the low stone fence around her garden. She rarely spoke of her past. When villagers asked where she had come from, she would smile politely and change the subject, and most learned quickly not to press further. Only Ivy Calloway, who visited twice a year despite the long journey, knew the full truth of what Ren had left behind. "You could come back, you know," Ivy told her during one such visit, sitting across from Ren at her small wooden table, a cup of tea warming her hands. "Things have changed. People ask about you sometimes." Ren shook her head, the same way she always did. "There is nothing to go back to," she said. "I have a life here. A good one. I do not need the crown or the pack or any of it." Ivy studied her friend's face for a long moment, noticing the way Ren's eyes still flickered with something unspoken whenever the subject of Ravenmoor arose, something that looked very much like a wound that had never fully healed, no matter how much time had passed. She said nothing more about it that visit, but she left with the same quiet worry she always carried away from these conversations, the sense that Ren's peace was built on a foundation that could crumble the moment the past came looking for her again. Neither of them knew how soon that moment would arrive. Far away, in Ravenmoor, a storm was gathering on the northern horizon, one unlike anything the oldest pack members could remember. The clouds rolled in dark and low, carrying a strange, restless energy that made the animals in the forest grow quiet, and the wind howl through the mountain passes with a sound like a warning. The pack elders spoke of old stories, tales of storms that seemed to follow fate rather than weather, storms that arrived exactly when destiny needed to force two paths back together. Kaelin Voss paid little attention to such stories. He had a border patrol to lead the following morning, a routine journey along the northern edge of Ravenmoor territory, where reports of unfamiliar scents had been troubling his enforcers for weeks. He prepared for the patrol the way he prepared for everything, with discipline and focus, pushing aside the strange unease that had settled over him in recent days, an unease he could not name and refused to examine too closely. He did not know, as he closed his eyes that night, that the storm gathering beyond the mountains would soon strip away every wall he had built around his heart, and that somewhere beyond the reach of Ravenmoor's borders, the scent he had spent years trying to forget was waiting for him, closer than he could possibly imagine. The morning of the patrol began under a sky the color of ash. Kalen rode at the front of a small group of enforcers, his second in command, a broad-shouldered warrior named Callum Reyes, riding just behind him. The wind had picked up steadily since dawn, carrying a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest cloaks, and the horses grew skittish as they climbed the narrow mountain trail that marked the northern edge of Ravenmoor territory. "This does not feel like an ordinary storm," Callum said, glancing up at the churning clouds. "The animals have gone silent. Even the birds left the trees an hour ago." Kalen said nothing at first, studying the horizon where the clouds had darkened to near black, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though some force beyond nature were shaping them. He had felt the same unease Callum described, a pressure building behind his ribs since the moment they left the castle gates. But he was not a king who spoke openly of feelings he could not explain. "Keep the group moving," he said instead. "We finish the patrol and return before the worst of it reaches us." They pressed on for another hour, following the ridge that overlooked the wide valley separating Ravenmoor from the neutral lands beyond. The wind grew stronger with every mile, tearing at cloaks and manes, forcing the enforcers to shout to be heard over its howl. Then, without warning, the sky split open. Rain fell in sheets so thick it became difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Lightning cracked across the horizon in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled through the mountains with a force that made the ground itself seem to tremble. The horses reared in fright, and within moments, the tight formation of enforcers scattered, as everyone fought to control their frightened mounts. "Fall back to the ridge caves," Kalen shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. He turned his horse hard, searching for Callum and the others through the blinding rain, but visibility had dropped to almost nothing. A bolt of lightning struck a nearby pine, splitting it in half with a deafening crack, and Kalen's horse bucked violently, throwing him from the saddle before bolting into the gray wall of rain. Kalen hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively to absorb the impact, years of training keeping him from serious injury despite the force of the fall. He pushed himself up, soaked through in seconds, the wind so strong it nearly knocked him back down. He called out for Callum, for any of his enforcers, but the storm answered only with thunder. He was alone. For a long moment, Kalen simply stood still, letting his senses adjust to the chaos around him, trying to find some direction in the endless gray rain and howling wind. As a king and an alpha, he had faced dangerous situations before, battles and negotiations and threats to his territory that would have broken lesser men. But there was something different about this storm, something that felt less like weather and more like a force with intention behind it, pushing him steadily in a direction he had not chosen for himself. He began walking, following the slope of the land downward, reasoning that shelter was more likely to be found in the lower valley than on the exposed ridge where the lightning struck hardest. The rain did not ease as he walked. If anything, it grew heavier, until the world around him narrowed to nothing but gray water and the sound of his own labored breathing. After what felt like hours, though it may have only been one, Kalen spotted a shape through the rain that did not belong to the natural landscape, a straight line where the trees should have curved, a roof pitched at an angle that spoke of human hands rather than nature. He pushed toward it, driven by exhaustion and the growing cold that had begun to seep into his bones despite his alpha strength. The shape resolved itself into a small stone cabin, half hidden by overgrown brush, clearly abandoned for some time judging by the state of its walls and the boards nailed haphazardly across one window. Kalen did not care about its condition. He forced the door open against years of swollen wood and stepped inside, the sudden absence of wind and rain almost overwhelming after the chaos of the storm outside. Inside, the cabin was small but dry, a single room with a stone hearth in one corner and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered against the walls. Kaylan sank down against the wall nearest the door, catching his breath, water pooling around him on the dusty floor. He would need to wait out the storm here, he decided, and hope that Callum and the others had found shelter of their own somewhere along the ridge. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to rest, and that was when he caught it. A scent, faint at first, carried on the damp air that had followed him in through the open door, something that should not have been possible to detect after so much time and so much distance, something that struck him with the force of a physical blow. Kaylan's eyes snapped open. His heart began to pound in a way it had not pounded in years, not during battles, not during the tensest negotiations of his reign, not even during the ceremony where he had spoken words he had spent every day since trying to forget. He rose to his feet slowly, breathing in deeply, certain his mind was playing tricks born of exhaustion and the strange energy of the storm, but the scent remained, faint, distant, carried on the wind that slipped through the cracks of the old cabin walls, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever known it as intimately as he had. It was warm and soft, like wildflowers after rain, layered beneath something uniquely her own, that no perfume or soap could ever replicate, a scent that marked her as his fated mate no matter how many years had passed since he had thrown that bond away. Wren. It could not be her. Ravenmoor's northern patrol did not extend anywhere near where she might have settled, if she had even stayed within 100 miles of the territory after everything that happened. He told himself it was impossible, that grief and exhaustion could conjure phantom scents, in a mind desperate enough to want something it had lost. But even as he tried to convince himself, his body was already moving toward the door, drawn by an instinct far older and far stronger than logic. He stepped back out into the storm. The rain had not lessened, but Kaylan barely noticed it now. His focus narrowed entirely to the thread of scent weaving through the wet air, growing stronger the further he walked from the cabin. He followed it down a slope thick with wild grass, through a stand of trees bent nearly sideways by the wind, his heart hammering harder with every step that confirmed what his instincts already knew. It was her. After all these years, it was truly her. He had told himself so many times that whatever bond once connected them had been severed the moment he spoke the rejection aloud in front of the entire pack. He had built his entire understanding of that day around the belief that walking away from her had been final, complete, unchangeable. But no bond that could still call to him like this, pulling him forward through a storm that defied nature itself, could ever have been as broken as he pretended. The scent led him toward a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a small homestead nestled against the base of a hill, a stone cottage with smoke curling from its chimney despite the storm, warm light glowing faintly behind shuttered windows. Kaylan stopped at the edge of the clearing, rain streaming down his face, staring at the cottage with a mixture of disbelief and a hope he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Somewhere inside that small home, after everything that had happened, after every wall he had built and every lie he had let himself believe, his rejected mate was waiting, completely unaware that the storm had just delivered her past directly to her door. Wren Hale sat by the fire in her small cottage, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands, listening to the storm batter against the shuttered windows. She had spent the day preparing remedies for the villagers who would need them once the weather cleared, dried herbs bundled neatly on the shelves above her workbench, jars of salve lined up in careful rows. The storm outside had grown stronger than anything she remembered in her years living at the edge of the village, but she felt safe enough within her sturdy stone walls, the fire crackling steadily against the cold. She had almost drifted into a light doze when a sound reached her through the wind, something different from the rain and thunder, a rhythm that did not belong to the storm. She sat up straighter, listening carefully, her senses honed by years of living alone, in a place where caution kept a person alive. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakably footsteps moving through the mud outside her door. Wren rose from her chair, setting the tea aside, her heart quickening, not with fear exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who understood that strangers rarely traveled through storms like this without urgent reason. She crossed to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, listening. A fist pounded against the door, 3 heavy knocks that shook the frame. "Please," a voice called from the other side, rough with exhaustion and half swallowed by the wind. "I need shelter." Wren hesitated only a moment before pulling back the heavy bolt and opening the door. Rain and wind rushed into the cottage immediately, along with a figure so soaked and wind-battered that for a long moment she did not recognize him at all. only registered the size of him, the way he filled the doorway, the desperate exhaustion in his stance. Then he lifted his head, and the firelight caught his face, and every drop of blood in Ren's body seemed to freeze at once. Kalen Voss stood in her doorway. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Rain dripped from his hair and ran down his face, and his eyes, the same eyes she had spent years trying to forget, stared back at her with an expression she could not read, shock and something rawer beneath it, something that looked almost like relief. "You," Ren finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ren." Her name left his mouth like something he had not allowed himself to say in years, careful and reverent and utterly stunned. "It is really you." Every instinct told her to slam the door shut, to bolt it and press her back against it and refuse to let this man, this king who had knelt her down in front of an entire pack and cast her aside like something unworthy, back into any part of her life. She had spent years building this quiet existence, precisely so that Ravenmoor and everyone in it could never touch her again. And now the very source of her deepest wound stood dripping on her doorstep, brought here by a storm that felt far too convenient to be an accident. But pack law was older than personal pain, and older still than pride. No traveler could be turned away from shelter during a storm this dangerous, not by anyone who called themselves honorable, and despite everything, Ren still held herself to that standard even now. "You may stay until the storm passes," she said finally, stepping back from the door, her voice cool and controlled, despite the storm raging inside her chest that matched the one outside. Nothing more than that. Kalen stepped inside, and Ren closed the door behind him, sealing them both into the small, warm space of her cottage, the fire casting long shadows across the walls as the wind continued to howl outside. He stood dripping near the entrance, seemingly unsure of what to do with himself, this powerful alpha king, reduced to an awkward guest in the home of the woman he had once discarded. "There are dry clothes in the chest by the wall," Ren said, turning away from him and busying her hands with the tea kettle, needing something to do that did not involve looking at his face. "They belonged to a traveler who stayed here once and never returned for them. They should fit well enough." "Thank you," Kalen said quietly. He changed behind the low partition she kept near the back of the cottage, and Ren focused entirely on preparing a second cup of tea, her hands steadier than she expected given how violently her heart still pounded. When he emerged, dressed in the plain brown clothes of a traveler rather than the fine cloth of a king, he looked, for a moment, almost like the young man she had once known before the crown had reshaped him into someone harder. He sat at her small wooden table without being asked, and Ren set the second cup of tea in front of him, before taking her own seat across from him, putting as much distance between them as the small table allowed. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice carefully flat. "This is nowhere near Ravenmoor territory. I was on patrol along the northern ridge when the storm hit," Kalen explained. "I was separated from my enforcers. I found an old cabin and took shelter there, and then—" He hesitated, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from it rather than on her face. "I caught your scent. I followed it here. I did not know it would lead me to you. I did not even believe it was possible." Ren's jaw tightened. Then this was chance, nothing more. "Perhaps," Kalen said, though something in his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own words. "Or perhaps some bonds do not break as easily as we tell ourselves they do." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with everything neither of them had said in years. Ren felt her carefully built composure threatening to crack, old anger rising alongside old grief, memories of that humiliating day in the Great Hall flooding back with a vividness she had spent years trying to dull. "Do not speak to me of bonds," she said, her voice sharper now, the calm control slipping. "You severed whatever bond we had the moment you knelt me down in front of your entire pack and called me unfit to stand beside you. Do you have any idea what that day cost me? I lost everything. My home, my friends, my place among my own people, all because you decided I was not strong enough for a crown." Kalen flinched at the force of her words, and for a moment, the composed mask of a king slipped away entirely, revealing something far more uncertain underneath. "I know," he said quietly. "I have known for a long time that what I did was wrong. I told myself it was necessary, that the pack needed strength I thought you could not provide. But the truth is, I let myself be convinced of things I should have questioned. I have regretted that day, every single day since. Regret does not undo humiliation, Ren said, though her voice had lost some of its sharpness, replaced by a weariness that came from carrying old pain for far too long. Regret does not give me back the years I spent building a life from nothing, because the one I had was taken from me. No, Kaylin agreed, it does not. But I would still like the chance to understand what really happened that day, if you are willing to speak of it. There are things about that time that I have only recently begun to question. Ren studied him for a long moment across the small table, the firelight flickering between them, the storm still raging beyond the walls of her cottage. Every instinct told her to refuse, to send him back out into the storm the moment it weakened even slightly, to protect the careful peace she had built for herself in this quiet corner of the world. But some deeper part of her, buried beneath years of hurt, recognized something genuine in the way he looked at her now, something that had not been present in the cold, distant king who had rejected her in front of hundreds of witnesses. The storm shows no sign of passing tonight, she said finally, glancing toward the shuttered window where the wind continued to howl. You will stay until it clears. Nothing more is decided beyond that. Kaylin nodded, accepting the boundary she had drawn, and for the first time since he had appeared in her doorway, Ren allowed herself to breathe a little easier, though the tangled mixture of anger, grief, and something else entirely, something she refused to name even to herself, continued to churn beneath her carefully guarded exterior long into the night. The storm did not weaken during the night. If anything, it grew fiercer, rattling the shutters of the small cottage and sending gusts of wind whistling through every gap in the stone walls. Ren gave Kaylin a thin blanket and pointed him toward a spot near the fire, then retreated to the small room at the back of the cottage that served as her bedroom, closing the door firmly behind her, though sleep did not come easily. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm, and to the faint sounds of Kaylin shifting near the hearth, unable to quiet the storm of memories his sudden appearance had stirred within her. She remembered the way his voice had sounded across the great hall the day of the rejection, cold and final. And she remembered, too, the years before that, back when they were children training together in the fields behind Ravenmoor's barracks, when he had once carried her home on his back, after she twisted her ankle chasing a rabbit through the woods, laughing the entire way despite her protests that she could walk on her own. That boy had disappeared somewhere between childhood and the throne. Or perhaps, she thought bitterly, he had simply been buried beneath the expectations of a crown that demanded he value strength over kindness. Either way, the man who had knelt her down in that hall had not been the boy she once loved, and she reminded herself of that fact firmly, before finally allowing exhaustion to pull her into an uneasy sleep. Morning brought no relief from the storm. Ren woke to the sound of wind still howling outside, and when she emerged from her room, she found Kaylin already awake, sitting near the dying embers of the fire, adding fresh wood with careful, practiced movements that surprised her, given his station. You did not have to do that, she said, nodding toward the fire. I wanted to, Kaylin replied simply. You gave me shelter. The least I can do is keep the fire going. Ren said nothing, moving instead to prepare a simple breakfast from the stores she kept in her small pantry, oats and dried berries, and a bit of honey she had traded for at the village market weeks before. She worked in silence, aware of Kaylin's presence behind her, in a way that made her movements feel stiffer than usual, more deliberate, as though she needed to prove to herself that his presence changed nothing about her routine. They ate together at the small table, the silence between them heavy, but not entirely uncomfortable, both of them clearly searching for words that felt too large and too complicated to speak easily. It was Kaylin who finally broke the quiet. Tell me about your life here, he said. You built all of this yourself? Ren nodded slowly. It took time. I arrived with nothing, only the clothes I wore and a small bag of coins I had saved. The village took me in without questions, and I offered my healing skills in exchange for shelter and food, until I could build something of my own. She glanced around the small cottage, at the neat shelves of herbs and remedies she had gathered over the years. It is a quiet life. I help the sick, I tend my garden, and no one here expects anything more of me than kindness and honesty. It sounds peaceful, Kaylin said, and there was something wistful in his voice that surprised her. It is, Ren agreed, more peaceful than anything I knew in Ravenmoor, at least in the end. Kaylin set down his spoon, his expression turning more serious. Ren, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, no matter how difficult the question may be. Do you know why the elders truly opposed our bonding? I was told it was a matter of pack stability, that an Omega with your particular gifts represented an unpredictable variable the pack could not risk during a period of expansion. But I have begun to wonder if that reasoning was ever entirely true, or if it was simply the excuse I was given to accept. Ren's hands stilled around her cup. She had wondered the same thing herself many times over the years, lying awake in this very cottage, turning the events of that final year in Ravenmoor over and over in her mind, searching for an explanation that made sense of how quickly the pack's opinion of her had shifted from acceptance to open opposition. I do not know all of it, she admitted slowly, but I remember things that troubled me even then. Whispers among the elders that grew louder in the months before the ceremony. Meetings I was not invited to, though as your intended mate, I should have been present for at least some of them. And I remember Dorian Ashcombe, always near you, always speaking quietly into your ear whenever I entered a room, as though he needed to remind you of something the moment I appeared. Kaelin's brow furrowed. Dorian has been my advisor since before I took the throne. I trusted him completely. I am not saying he betrayed you outright, Ren said carefully, though the words felt strange leaving her mouth, as though she were finally giving voice to a suspicion she had buried for years. Out of fear it would seem like bitterness rather than truth. But I always found it strange how quickly the elder's opinion of me changed, once he began advising you more closely. Before that year, no one questioned my place beside you. After it, suddenly everyone did. Kaelin sat back in his chair, his expression troubled, clearly turning her words over in his mind, with the same careful consideration he gave to matters of state. I need to think on this, he said finally. If there is truth to what you are suggesting, it changes everything I believed about that time in my life. It will not undo what happened, Ren said quietly, though not unkindly. Whatever the reason, the outcome remains the same. I was rejected in front of everyone I knew, and I built a new life because the old one was taken from me. No, Kaelin agreed, it will not undo it. But if I was deceived into making that choice, I owe it to both of us to understand exactly how, and by whom. The storm continued to rage outside as they sat together in the quiet warmth of the cottage, the conversation between them shifting from careful distance toward something more complicated, something neither of them was fully prepared to name. Ren found herself studying his face as he spoke, searching for traces of the boy she once loved beneath the hardened features of the king he had become, and to her quiet surprise, she found more of that boy remaining than she had expected. Outside, the wind howled on, showing no sign of weakening, as though the storm itself understood that these two people needed far more time trapped together than either of them had originally intended. By the third day, the storm had softened into a steady gray rain, though the wind still made travel through the mountain passes impossible. Ren had grown accustomed, in a strange and reluctant way, to Kaelin's presence in her small cottage, though she still guarded her words carefully whenever they spoke, unwilling to let the walls she had built crumble too quickly after everything that had happened between them. On the third afternoon, while Ren organized her herb shelves and Kaelin sat nearby mending a torn strap from his traveling pack, a knock came at the door, sharper and more urgent than the wind alone could produce. Ren answered it to find a young village boy named Nolan, soaked through and breathless, clutching a folded piece of parchment in his shaking hand. "Healer Ren," the boy gasped, "my mother sent me. My little sister has taken a fever, a bad one, and nothing we try brings it down. Please, you have to come." Ren did not hesitate. She grabbed her healing bag from beside the door and turned to follow the boy out into the rain, but Kaelin rose immediately from his seat. "Let me come with you," he said. "The paths will be dangerous in this weather, and an extra set of hands may help if the child needs to be carried." Ren hesitated only a moment before nodding, recognizing the practical wisdom in his offer, despite everything unresolved between them. They followed Nolan through the muddy paths of the village, rain still falling steadily around them, until they reached a small cottage, where a woman stood in the doorway, wringing her hands with worry. Inside, a young girl no older than 6 lay on a narrow bed, her face flushed with fever, her small body trembling despite the blankets piled over her. Ren moved immediately to the girl's side, pressing a gentle hand against her forehead, her healer's instincts taking over completely, as she assessed the situation with practiced calm. "How long has she been like this?" Ren asked the mother. Since yesterday evening, the woman answered, her voice tight with fear. It has only gotten worse since then. Ren opened her healing bag and began mixing a remedy from the herbs she carried, her hands moving with the confident precision of years of practice. Kaylin stood back near the doorway, watching quietly, struck by the transformation in her, the way her entire demeanor shifted into focused, capable authority the moment someone needed her help. This was not the fragile Omega that Dorian and the elders had once described to him. This was a woman entirely in command of her considerable skill. As Ren worked, gently coaxing the remedy into the feverish child, while murmuring soft, reassuring words, Kaylin felt something shift within his chest, a growing certainty that the rejection he had spoken years ago had been built on a foundation of lies he had been too blind, or too willing, to question at the time. The remedy took effect slowly over the following hour, the child's fever beginning to break, her trembling easing into a more restful sleep. The mother wept with relief, thanking Ren over and over, and Ren accepted the gratitude with the quiet humility of someone who had done this many times before and never grown tired of the outcome. As they walked back toward Ren's cottage through the lessening rain, Kaylin finally spoke what had been building in his mind since watching her work. "You saved that child's life," he said. "The way you moved, the confidence in every decision you made, that was not the healing of someone with limited or unstable gifts. That was mastery." Ren glanced at him sideways. "I have always known my own worth, Kaylin. It was others who chose not to see it." "I see it now," he said quietly. "I should have seen it years ago." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, less guarded, though still heavy with everything unresolved. When they reached the cottage, Ren set her healing bag down near the door and turned to face him directly for the first time since his arrival. "Why does this matter to you now?" she asked. "After all these years, why does my worth suddenly need proving to you?" Kaylin was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I think I made the greatest mistake of my life the day I rejected you, and I have spent years telling myself it was necessary, without ever truly examining why. Seeing you here, seeing the life you built and the skill you carry, it forces me to confront how wrong I was, and how easily I let myself be convinced of something that was never true. That does not change what happened," Ren said, though her voice had softened slightly. "No," Kaylin agreed, "but it changes what I intend to do about it." Ren studied him carefully, searching his face for any trace of the manipulation or coldness that had defined the king who rejected her years before, and finding instead something that looked remarkably like genuine remorse. She was not ready to forgive him. Not yet. Not after everything the rejection had cost her. But she found herself, for the first time since his arrival, willing to consider that the man standing before her might truly be different from the one who had spoken those cruel words in the great hall. "The rain has nearly stopped," she said finally, glancing up at the softening sky. "You will likely be able to return to your patrol group by tomorrow." Kaylin followed her gaze upward, and something in his expression flickered with what might have been disappointment, though he said nothing about it directly. "Then I suppose I should be grateful for the time the storm gave us," he said instead, "even if it was not the reunion either of us expected." Ren did not answer immediately, turning instead to open her cottage door, though as she stepped inside, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to consider that perhaps this unexpected reunion had given her something she had not realized she still needed after all these years, a chance to finally understand the truth behind the pain that had shaped so much of her life since leaving Ravenmoor behind. That evening, as the rain finally faded into a light mist and the wind settled into a gentle breeze, Ren found herself standing before an old wooden trunk pushed into the corner of her bedroom, the one place in her cottage she had never allowed herself to fully unpack. Inside it were the few belongings she had carried with her from Ravenmoor all those years ago, things she had never been able to throw away despite the pain they carried. She hesitated for a long moment before lifting the lid, staring down at the folded cloaks and small keepsakes she had not looked at in years. Near the bottom, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth, sat a small bundle of letters, correspondence she had received in the final months before the rejection ceremony, from friends and allies within the pack, who had grown increasingly concerned about the shifting mood of the elders. She carried the bundle out to the main room, where Kaylin sat near the fire, and set it on the table in front of him, without a word of explanation at first. "What is this?" he asked, glancing up at her. Letters, Ren said, taking a seat across from him. From the months before the ceremony. I kept them because I could never quite bring myself to burn them, though I told myself for years that I would never need them again. Kalen reached for the top letter carefully, unfolding the aged parchment, with the same reverence he might have shown a sacred document. The handwriting was neat and hurried, clearly written in haste by someone worried about being overheard. The letter was from Ivy Calloway, dated several months before the ceremony. Kalen read through it slowly, his expression darkening with every line. Ivy had written to warn Ren of strange meetings taking place among certain elders, meetings that Dorian Ashcombe attended without the king's knowledge, discussions about the dangers of allowing an Omega with rare healing gifts too close to the throne, fears that such power, if left unchecked, could eventually rival the authority of the crown itself. This says the meetings began well before the elders ever expressed concerns to me directly, Kalen said, his voice tight. By the time I heard the objections, they were already presented as settled pack opinion, not new discussion. There is more, Ren said quietly, sliding another letter across the table. This one was from a healer named Grace Elwood, a distant cousin of Ren's, who had remained in Ravenmoor after Ren's departure. The letter, dated shortly after the rejection ceremony, described how Dorian had personally overseen the reassignment of several pack members who had spoken in Ren's defense during the private council discussions, moving them to distant outposts under the guise of routine duty rotations, effectively silencing any voices that might have challenged the narrative building against her. Kalen set the letter down slowly, his hands not quite steady. I never knew any of this, he said. I never questioned why the council seemed so unified against you. I assumed it was genuine consensus. Dorian built that consensus, Ren said. Carefully, over months, moving pieces into place long before you ever had to make a public decision. By the time the ceremony arrived, you were not choosing freely. You were confirming a decision that had already been made for you. Kalen sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the weight of the realization settling over him heavily. Why would he do this? What threat could you possibly pose to his position that would justify years of careful manipulation? Ren considered the question for a long moment before answering. My gifts are rare, Kalen. Healing power like mine has not appeared in Ravenmoor's bloodlines for generations, and such power, bonded to a king, carries influence beyond the healing house. I could have advised you on matters of health and strategy that Dorian alone controlled. I could have earned trust among the pack that might have eventually rivaled his own. I do not know if he saw me as an immediate threat, but I believe he saw me as a future one, and he acted before that future could take shape. Kalen was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, piecing together years of subtle manipulations he had never recognized as anything other than sound counsel. He thought of every private conversation Dorian had steered, every decision that had somehow always aligned with removing potential rivals to his influence, and the picture that emerged was far darker than anything he had imagined. I trusted him with everything, Kalen said finally, his voice low with barely controlled anger. I let him shape my understanding of you, of our bond, of an entire year of my life, and I never once thought to question it. You were deceived by someone skilled at deception, Ren said, and though her voice carried old pain, it also carried something gentler than he expected, something close to understanding. That does not erase the hurt his lies caused me, but it does change who deserves the blame for it. Kalen looked up at her, meeting her eyes directly. I intend to find out exactly what he has done, Ren, and I intend to make it right, both for you and for the pack he has been quietly manipulating for years. But I cannot do this without your help. You have evidence I need, and knowledge of what happened that I was never given access to. Ren hesitated, old caution warring with the growing certainty that the life she had built here, peaceful as it was, could never fully heal the wound left by an injustice that had never been corrected. If I help you, she said slowly, it means returning to Ravenmoor. It means facing everything I left behind. I know, Kalen said. I would not ask it of you if I believed there was another way, but I believe the truth deserves to be known, and I believe you deserve to see the man responsible for your pain finally held accountable. Ren stared at the letters spread across her table, evidence of a betrayal that had shaped years of her life without her ever fully understanding its true architect, and felt something shift within her, a resolve hardening beneath the old grief that had never fully healed. "Then we go together," she said finally, "but I will not simply forgive what happened, because the true villain has been revealed. Dorian deceived you, but you still spoke those words in front of everyone I knew. That wound is yours to answer for as well." "I understand," Kaelin said quietly, "and I intend to answer for it, in whatever way you need me to." Outside, the last of the storm clouds finally broke apart, revealing a clear night sky scattered with stars, as though the world itself understood that the true storm between them was only just beginning. They left the village at first light the next morning, Ren carrying only a small bag with essential belongings, and the bundle of letters carefully wrapped to protect them from the weather. She had said her goodbyes to the villagers quickly, promising to return, though even she was uncertain how long this journey back into her past might take. Ivy Calloway, coincidentally visiting for her seasonal check on her friend, insisted on accompanying them, her expression grim with determination, once she learned the full truth of what Dorian had done. "I always suspected something was wrong," Ivy said, as they walked the muddy path leading away from the village, the morning air still cool and damp from days of rain. "The way the elders suddenly turned against you, it never made sense given how well-liked you had always been. I should have pushed harder to understand why." "None of us could have known the depth of it," Ren said, though she appreciated her friend's loyalty all the same. The journey back toward Ravenmoor took the better part of 2 days, following paths that Kaelin knew well from years of patrols and diplomatic travels. Along the way, they encountered Callum Reyes and the remaining enforcers from the original patrol group, who had weathered the storm safely in the Ridge Caves, and had been searching for their missing king since the weather cleared. Callum's relief at finding Kaelin alive was quickly followed by shock at recognizing the woman traveling beside him. "My king," Callum said carefully, his eyes flicking between Kaelin and Ren with poorly hidden surprise. "We feared the worst when you did not return to the caves." "I found shelter," Kaelin said simply, "and I found something far more important than shelter. Callum, I need you to keep what you are about to hear between us until I decide how best to proceed. Can I trust you with that?" Callum, a warrior who had served Kaelin loyally since before he took the throne, nodded without hesitation. "Always, my king." Kaelin explained, as they continued their journey together, the evidence Ren had shared with him, the letters detailing Dorian's careful manipulation of the pack elders, the reassignment of allies who might have spoken in Ren's defense, the years of quiet influence building toward a single devastating outcome. Callum's expression grew increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "I always found Dorian's counsel odd in certain moments," Callum admitted. "There were decisions he pushed for that seemed to serve no purpose beyond consolidating certain loyalties around himself. I never thought to question it, assuming his experience justified his judgment." "None of us questioned it," Kaelin said grimly. "That is precisely how he was able to do this for so long." As they approached the outer villages of Ravenmoor territory, word began to spread quickly among the pack members they passed, whispers rippling outward that the king had returned safely, accompanied by an Omega many recognized despite the years that had passed since her departure. By the time they reached the gates of Ravenmoor Castle itself, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring with curiosity and, in some cases, open shock at seeing Ren Ashford walking beside the king who had once rejected her so publicly. Ren felt the weight of every stare pressing down on her, memories of the humiliation she had suffered in that very courtyard, threatening to overwhelm her composure. She kept her chin lifted, her spine straight, refusing to let old fear show on her face, despite the tightness gripping her chest. Inside the castle walls, Dorian Ashcombe received word of the king's return, with the same careful, controlled expression he always maintained, though something flickered behind his eyes when he learned the identity of the woman accompanying him. He moved quickly to intercept them in the main courtyard, his smile as practiced and warm as ever. "My king," Dorian said, bowing slightly, "we feared for your safety during the storm. I am relieved to see you returned unharmed." His eyes shifted toward Ren, and for just a moment, something colder passed across his expression, before the warm mask settled back into place. "And you have brought a guest. How unexpected." "Not entirely unexpected," Kaelin said, his voice carrying a new edge that Dorian had likely never heard directed at him before. "Ren and I have much to discuss with the council. I would like you present for that discussion as well, Dorian. There are matters from several years ago that require clarification." Something in Kaelin's tone must have carried warning, because Dorian's practiced composure flickered again, just briefly, before he inclined his head in agreement. "Of course, my king. Whatever you require." As Dorian turned to walk ahead of them toward the great hall, Ren caught Kaelin's eye, and something passed between them, a shared understanding that the confrontation they had traveled 2 days to prepare for was about to begin far sooner than either of them had expected. She squared her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of strength she had built over the years since leaving this place behind, and followed the king and his advisor into the very hall where her humiliation had first begun. This time, she told herself, she would not leave in shame. This time, the truth would finally be spoken aloud, and the man responsible for years of manufactured pain would finally answer for what he had done. The council meeting was set for the following morning, giving Kaelin time to gather the pack elders and present the evidence Ren had carried from her cottage. Ren was given quarters in the castle's guest wing for the night, close enough to Ivy's room that neither woman felt entirely alone in a place still thick with painful memories. Kaelin, meanwhile, retreated to his private study, poring over old council records alongside Callum, searching for any additional evidence of Dorian's manipulations that might strengthen the case they intended to present. Dorian, for his part, appeared calm throughout the evening, attending to his usual duties with the same composed efficiency he always displayed. But behind the careful mask, his mind worked quickly, calculating the danger that Ren's return posed to everything he had spent years building. He understood, better than anyone else in the castle, exactly what evidence she likely carried, and he understood that if it reached the council intact, his position, his influence, and quite possibly his freedom, would be lost entirely. He could not allow that to happen. Late that night, long after most of the castle had settled into sleep, Dorian summoned 2 enforcers he had cultivated as personal loyalists over the years, men who owed their positions and privileges entirely to his patronage rather than to Kaelin's direct command. He met them in a quiet corridor away from the main guard patrols, his voice low and urgent. "The Omega's staying in the guest wing," he said. "She carries documents that could cause significant disruption to the pack's stability if presented to the council tomorrow. I need those documents retrieved and destroyed before morning." Quietly, without drawing attention. The enforcers exchanged a glance before one of them spoke. "And the Omega herself?" Dorian's expression remained carefully blank. "Handle the situation however necessary to ensure the documents do not reach the council. I trust you understand what I am asking." The 2 enforcers nodded and slipped away into the darkened corridors of the castle, moving with the practiced quiet of men accustomed to operating beyond the boundaries of official duty. Ren, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion from the journey, sat awake in her guest chamber, reviewing the letters once more by candlelight, when she heard a soft, deliberate sound at her door, the careful click of a lock being tested rather than knocked upon. Her instincts, honed by years of caution living alone, flared immediately to alertness. She rose quietly from her chair and moved to press her ear against the door. The lock gave way with a quiet click, and the door began to ease open. Ren did not wait to see who entered. She grabbed the small dagger she kept in her healing bag for cutting herbs and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Years of quiet self-reliance, overriding panic. The moment the first figure stepped through the doorway, she struck, not to cause serious harm, but enough to create the noise and confusion needed to alert the rest of the castle. Her cry rang out through the corridor as she scrambled away from the second enforcer, who lunged toward her, and within moments, the sound of running footsteps echoed from both directions as castle guards responded to the commotion. Kaelin, who had still been awake in his study, only 2 corridors away, was among the first to arrive, his blood running cold at the sight of Ren pressed against the far wall of her chamber, breathing hard but unharmed, while 2 unfamiliar enforcers were quickly subdued by the responding guards. "Ren." Kaelin crossed the room in an instant, his hands gently checking her for injury, despite her insistence that she was unharmed. "What happened?" "They came for the letters," Ren said, her voice shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "I do not know who sent them, but they clearly wanted those documents destroyed before the council meeting." Kaelin's jaw tightened as he turned toward the 2 captured enforcers, both restrained now by castle guards, their expressions carefully blank despite the obvious severity of the situation. "Who ordered this?" Kaelin demanded, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as king. Neither enforcer spoke at first, clearly weighing loyalty to Dorian against the consequences of continued silence. But Callum, who had arrived shortly after Kaelin, stepped forward with a grim expression. "My king, I recognize these two. They have served under Dorian's direct assignment for the better part of 3 years, handling matters he preferred kept separate from official channels." Kaelin's expression darkened further, the last fragile pieces of trust he had held for his advisor, finally shattering completely. "Take them to the holding cells," he ordered, "and ensure the letters are secured immediately. Nothing happens to them before tomorrow's council session." As the guards led the 2 enforcers away, Kaelin turned back to Ren, his expression a mixture of fury and something far softer. A fear he had not expected to feel so intensely at the thought of losing her again, this time permanently. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have anticipated that Dorian would act once he learned of your return. I placed you in danger by bringing you back here." "You did not place me in danger," Ren said, though her voice still carried the residual tremor of adrenaline. "Dorian did, the moment he decided my safety mattered less than protecting his own position. This only confirms everything the letters already suggested about the kind of man he truly is." Kaelin nodded slowly, though the guilt in his expression did not fully fade. "Tomorrow, this ends," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Whatever loyalty he thinks he still commands, whatever influence he believes protects him, it ends the moment the council hears the truth." Ren looked at him steadily, drawing strength from the fierce determination in his eyes, so different from the cold detachment she remembered from the day of her rejection. "Then let us make certain the truth is heard clearly," she said, "and let us make certain he cannot silence it again." Outside, the castle settled slowly back into an uneasy quiet, though sleep would not come easily to anyone within its walls that night, each person keenly aware that the following morning would bring a reckoning years in the making. The great hall of Ravenmoor Castle stood filled to capacity the following morning, every pack elder and senior enforcer summoned to attend what had been announced only as a matter of urgent council business. Word of the previous night's incident had already spread quickly through the castle, whispered from guard to guard and servant to servant, so that by the time the council gathered, an air of tense anticipation hung over the entire hall. Kaelin stood at the top of the same stone steps where he had once spoken the words of rejection that shattered Ren's life, though this time his posture carried none of the cold detachment of that earlier day. Beside him stood Ren, her chin lifted, her expression composed despite the weight of every eye in the hall settling upon her, many of them wide with shock at her unexpected return. Dorian stood near the front of the assembled elders, his expression carefully neutral, though Ren noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked briefly toward the 2 captured enforcers who stood under guard near the side of the hall, their presence alone a silent testament to the events of the previous night. "Several years ago," Kaelin began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "I stood in this very place and rejected my fated mate, believing at the time that I acted in the best interest of this pack. I have since learned that the council which shaped that decision was built upon deliberate deception, and I intend, today, to reveal the full truth of what occurred." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Kaelin raised a hand for silence before continuing, recounting in careful detail the evidence contained within the letters Ren had preserved, the private meetings held without his knowledge, the systematic reassignment of pack members who had spoken in Ren's defense, and finally, the attack orchestrated the previous night against the very evidence that now threatened to expose the truth. As Kaelin spoke, he presented the letters themselves to the gathered elders, allowing several senior members of the council to examine the handwriting and seals firsthand, confirming their authenticity. Ivy Calloway, standing near the front of the assembly, spoke in support of the letter's origins, describing the private meetings she had witnessed years before that had prompted her original warnings to Ren. Dorian's composure began to crack visibly as the evidence mounted, his careful smile replaced by a tightening jaw and narrowed eyes. When Kaelin finally turned to address him directly, the entire hall fell into absolute silence. "Dorian Ashcombe," Kaelin said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger, "you served as my most trusted advisor for years, and I extended you a level of trust few others in this pack ever received. You used that trust to manipulate the council, to silence anyone who might have challenged your influence, and to orchestrate the rejection of my fated mate out of fear that her presence beside the throne threatened your own position. And when the truth threatened to surface, you sent enforcers to attack her in the night, to destroy evidence and, if necessary, to silence her permanently. Do you deny any of this? For a long moment, Dorian said nothing, his eyes sweeping across the hall, calculating whether any path remained toward preserving his position. But the evidence was too thorough, the testimony too consistent, and the two captured enforcers, when finally questioned before the assembled council, confirmed under pressure that Dorian himself had ordered the previous night's attack. Finally, Dorian's composed mask fell away entirely, replaced by something colder and more bitter. I did what was necessary to protect this pack, he said, his voice carrying none of its usual practiced warmth. An Omega with power like hers, bonded to the throne, would have eventually eclipsed every advisor who came before her. I acted to prevent instability, nothing more. You acted to protect your own influence, Kaelin said sharply, and you were willing to harm an innocent woman and deceive your king for years to do it. That is not protection. That is betrayal of the highest order. The council elders conferred quietly for several tense minutes before delivering their judgment. Dorian Ashcombe was stripped immediately of his title and his position within the pack, his lands and holdings forfeited to the crown, and he was banished from Ravenmoor territory permanently, forbidden from ever returning under threat of severe punishment. Guards escorted him from the hall as murmurs of shock and quiet satisfaction rippled through the assembled crowd, the years of hidden manipulation finally exposed and answered for. As Dorian's presence disappeared from the hall, the tension that had gripped the room slowly began to ease, replaced by a growing sense that something long broken within Ravenmoor had finally been set right. Kaelin turned to face Ren, who stood beside him with an expression caught somewhere between vindication and lingering exhaustion from years of carrying this burden alone. It is done, Kaelin said quietly, for her ears alone. The truth has been spoken, and the man responsible has finally answered for what he did. Yes, Ren agreed softly, but my own wound remains, Kaelin. Dorian's deception explains why the rejection happened, but you were the one who spoke those words. That is a truth that does not disappear simply because we now understand who orchestrated it. Kaelin nodded slowly, meeting her eyes directly, his expression carrying none of the defensiveness she might have expected. I know, he said, and I do not expect forgiveness simply because the true architect of that day has been exposed. But I hope, in time, you will allow me the chance to earn back what I lost, through my own failures, not merely Dorian's manipulation. Ren studied him for a long moment, the weight of years of pain still heavy within her chest, but beneath it, something new had begun to take shape, a cautious hope she had not expected to feel again after everything that had happened. Time, she said finally. That is all I can offer for now. Kaelin accepted her answer with a solemn nod, understanding that whatever came next between them would need to be built slowly, with patience and honesty, rather than assumed simply because the truth had finally come to light. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, careful rebuilding to Ravenmoor, both within its council chambers and within the fragile space that had begun to grow between Kaelin and Ren. She did not return immediately to her cottage in the northern village, choosing instead to remain within Ravenmoor territory for a time, staying in a small house near the healing quarters that Ivy Calloway helped her secure, close enough to observe the changes taking place within the pack she had once fled. Kaelin worked diligently in those weeks to repair the damage Dorian's years of manipulation had caused, reinstating pack members who had been unjustly reassigned, reviewing council decisions that had been quietly influenced by his former advisor's hidden agenda, and slowly rebuilding a system of governance built on transparency, rather than the careful secrecy Dorian had cultivated. Many within the pack watched these changes with quiet approval, recognizing in their king a new commitment to honesty that had been notably absent during the years of Dorian's influence. Throughout this time, Kaelin made no demands of Ren, offering instead small, consistent gestures that spoke to genuine change rather than performance. He visited the healing quarters regularly, not to press his case for reconciliation, but simply to observe her work, to learn from her methods, and to demonstrate through patient presence that he valued her skill and her judgment in ways he had failed to show years before. He asked her opinion on matters of pack health policy, took her counsel seriously during council discussions, and slowly, carefully, began rebuilding the trust that Dorian's manipulation and his own failures had destroyed. Ren, for her part, allowed herself to observe these changes without rushing toward forgiveness she did not yet feel ready to offer. She spoke with Ivy often about the complicated mixture of emotions that Kaylin's efforts stirred within her. Old anger slowly softening, alongside a cautious hope she had not expected to feel again. "He is trying," Ivy observed one evening, as the two women shared tea in Wren's small borrowed house. "Truly trying, not simply performing contrition for the sake of appearances." "I know," Wren admitted. "And that frightens me more than his coldness ever did. It would be easier to hate him completely. It is far harder to forgive someone who is genuinely working to become better." Ivy smiled gently. Perhaps that difficulty is exactly why it matters so much. As the weeks turned into months, Wren found herself spending more time in Kaylin's company, not out of obligation, but because she discovered, slowly and to her own quiet surprise, that the boy she had once loved before the crown reshaped him was still present beneath the king he had become, now tempered by genuine humility, rather than hidden entirely beneath cold duty. They spoke often of the years they had lost, of the mistakes that had led them both to this point, and gradually, carefully, the old bond between them began to stir back to life, no longer buried beneath lies and manipulation, but built now on a foundation of hard-won honesty. One evening, nearly 6 months after the storm that had first brought them back together, Kaylin found Wren in the healing quarters garden, tending to a bed of herbs beneath the soft light of early evening. He approached slowly, giving her time to notice him before he spoke. "I have something to ask you," he said, "though I want you to know before I ask it that I expect nothing beyond whatever answer feels honest to you." Wren straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, studying his expression carefully. "Ask then." "I do not wish to simply undo the past," Kaylin said. "I cannot erase the pain I caused you, nor the years we lost because of my failures. But I would like the chance to build something new between us, openly and honestly, in front of the entire pack, if you are willing. Not because tradition demands it, but because I have come to understand, more clearly than I ever did years ago, exactly what I would be fortunate enough to have beside me." Wren was quiet for a long moment, the evening light catching the earnest hope in his expression, so different from the cold king who had once knelt her down before the entire pack. She thought of everything that had led them to this moment, the pain, the betrayal, the slow rebuilding of trust that had taken months of patient effort on both their parts. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady and certain in a way it had not been in years. "I am willing." The ceremony took place the following month, in the same great hall where Wren had once been rejected before the entire pack. This time, however, the hall was filled not with cold judgment, but with genuine celebration. Pack members gathered to witness the correction of an old wrong, and the beginning of something built on honesty, rather than manipulation. Ivy stood proudly among the witnesses, and Callum, now serving as Kaylin's most trusted advisor, oversaw the ceremonial details with quiet satisfaction. Kaylin stood at the top of the same stone steps where he had once spoken words that shattered Wren's life, and this time, he spoke words that mended it instead, publicly acknowledging the wrong he had done, honoring the strength and skill that had always defined her, and formally reclaiming her as his true and equal partner before the assembled pack. Wren stood tall beside him, no longer the frightened Omega who had once fled into the darkness of the northern woods, but a woman whose worth had finally been recognized fully and without reservation, not as a favor granted by a king, but as truth acknowledged at last. As the ceremony concluded and the pack erupted into celebration, Wren looked out over the crowd that had once watched her humiliation and now witnessed her vindication, and she felt, for the first time since that terrible day years before, a sense of peace settling fully into her chest. The storm that had once torn her life apart had, in the end, carried her back to exactly where she was always meant to be, not through chance alone, but through the slow, hard work of truth, finally overcoming years of carefully constructed lies. Kaylin took her hand as the celebration continued around them, and Wren felt the old bond between them settle into place, stronger now for having survived everything that had once threatened to destroy it completely. Whatever storms might come in the years ahead, she understood now that they would face them together, equals standing side by side, their bond finally free of the shadows that had once nearly ended it before it truly began.